Welcome back to another episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, David Zumwalt, the CEO of WISPs. David, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for this opportunity to talk.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Can you describe a little bit about WISPs and its membership? How many companies are you representing?
Yeah, so WISPs is 20 years old. It's a trade association that was formed by its members. And the members deploy wireless internet services generally in areas that have been overlooked by carriers. So that's been the history for the last 20 years or so. About 1,000 members spread across the U.S. that include operating members and also vendor members. So the manufacturing community is also supporting WISPs.
And how many households do your members cover approximately today?
So we've done some studies on this, and there are also some third-party studies. The WISP community supports somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 9 million subscribers, and that's a mix of residential and business customers.
Outstanding. So what led you to WISPs? What's your background? How did you get to be CEO?
So my background is in telecommunications, and that's a long story that we can get into, but I've been involved in wireless, I've been involved in engineering and network planning for a variety of networks, but I was actually running a WISP in the U.S. Virgin Islands, another great long story, and we were preparing the company for sale, and that sale was successful. And as I was coming out of that, I got contacted by representatives of WISPs who were looking for their next CEO.
And how was your operating experience play into the current role, or does it come night and day?
Well, no, I think that the experience of running a WISP was about a 9,000 subscriber WISP, so pretty good size. Good mix of customers. We had academic, we had government, we had enterprise, and we had residential customers. And dealing with all of the challenges that entails gave me a really good taste of what our members deal with day in and day out within their own communities.
And you lived in the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, and
yes.
Then you had to move. You moved to Dallas, is that right?
So
is that a good move?
So I'm originally from Dallas. I'm a long-suffering Dallas Cowboys fan.
Oh.
I know I'm going to get some grief or some sympathy from people who are listening to this.
You need no sympathy from me. I'm a Bills fan. Okay.
All right. I get it. So anyway, telecom big in Dallas, and so that's really where I cut my teeth and where I did a lot of my early work. But after selling a business that I'd helped build, I got involved in early stage venture capital and also a little bit of the private equity industry. And then I got contacted by a recruiter from the U.S. Virgin Islands looking for someone who could help create or build an economic development program that was leveraging the fact that the U.S. Virgin Islands is one of the most massive fiber hubs in the hemisphere. And this has to do with the build out of the global internet, submarine optical fiber systems that connect the continents. And the best place to connect Europe, Africa, Central, North, and South America in terms of just geographic, ideally, location is in the Eastern Caribbean. And the U.S. Virgin Islands, under the U.S. flag, provides contract law protections, it provides intellectual property protections. So it was a great place to site these massive hubs for AT&T and another company, Global Crossing. But they were put there not to benefit the Virgin Islands community. They were, it's global commerce. So my task in economic development was to break down those barriers and make it possible for that connectivity to be extended. So long story short, that's how I got there. We raised our kids there. That's how I ended up running an ISP there. And then eventually we came back to Dallas, and the rest is history.
Do you ever make it back?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Do you
That's fun.
Maintain property to enjoy?
No, we don't do that, but we have great friendships and great business colleague kind of alliances.
So WISPs members tend to be rather small. They can be mom and pop shops. They can be a little bit bigger. You have a couple members that are, more
right.
Larger size. Is the smallness, the nimbleness, is that a hindrance, or does it make it kind of the spunky competitor?
Well, I would say it's more the spunky competitor because if you look at the way many of WISPs members got started, an existing carrier, generally a telephone company or a cable company, would build out to the limits of their capital plan. And they'd get to a pole, and then that's as far as they could build that year for the next 5 years. So if you lived on the wrong side of the pole, you didn't have internet service. And so there would always be somebody in that neighborhood who said, I'm going to solve that problem. And so they figured out a way to extend internet service, and the next thing you knew, they had 500 subscribers, 1,000 subscribers, and then they started pairing up and consolidating, and now we have members that are over 100,000 subscribers. But they're always the hometown team. They're the ones that roll their trucks from the community. They're the ones that are invested in the community. They bank there, the kids go to school there. They're the ones who care most avidly for the growth and the health of their communities. So they are fierce competitors. They're very entrepreneurial, they're very agile, and they're real assets to the communities that they serve.
You answered one of my questions already. Do they tend to go to the areas that are unserved, or do they tend to kind of want to compete? And I think you answered that. What would you say the percentage of members that have to deal with an existing competitor? Is it relatively small?
No, these days I think most of our members would say that they have competition. And some of the competition can be really, really fierce. But because of their history, the fact that they got started where no one was serving, they have kind of this, let's push back the frontier mentality. So they're the ones who've been working in the digital divide. They're the ones who show up first to solve a problem.
WISPs members have this image or reputation being cowboys of internet service providers out there, internet broadband, if you will. They use whatever technology they make. You know, they're down at their local hardware store making things work. Has that changed over time? Is it matured? Has that changed the association, or is it still kind of that? You know, we talked about spunky competitors. It's still kind of that nature, no matter how big you get.
Yeah, I think that the way I would characterize certainly the members that I interact with, which is virtually all of them, they are dedicated to being agile, to remaining agile. But if you think about what's happened in the internet space over the last 20 years since WISPs has been around, we've gone from a space that did not have sort of the national priority that it does now. I mean, broadband for all is now a clear national priority, and that didn't happen overnight. So what we've seen is, for example, the FCC has gotten more interested in gathering data on where people are being served, how many internet service providers are serving, what the nature of the technologies that they use. The whole broadband data collection activity that we have now is representative. So the whole industry is kind of matured, and what our members have done is they've sought to remain agile and certainly stay ahead of what their customers' needs are going to be. But, you know, deep down inside, I'm sure that they all still like to think of themselves as a little bit cowboy. And again, Texas cowboy, I get it.
There's been this breakdown of at least in this technology kind of viewpoint between those companies that used licensed spectrum and those that used unlicensed. And
right.
Do you have kind of a picture of how many of your members kind of are, you know, that do have licenses today? Is there a good percentage that have some license in some form and then back it up with, or is it mostly unlicensed use?
So I think it started primarily as unlicensed because unlicensed spectrum was available, and that's a very, very quick way to get the job done. In fact, it's probably the quickest way to connect people because licenses can take time. Certainly, you know, we're talking about even in the lightly licensed regimens like CBRS, there's still a debate between larger carriers and smaller carriers about how large of an auction or a lottery or whatever size is being used, what kind of footprint will these licenses cover. And to the extent that those license areas are bigger, then it can be harder for smaller companies to compete. But that said, we have evidence that suggests that our members have more fiber in the digital divide than any other association does at this point in time. Now, I want to be careful about making that statement because eventually somebody is going to come and say, okay, let's compare notes. So that's not to make the case that, oh, you know, look what WISPs has done. But that's what we're getting back from our members. They are using the technology that is right for the job. So while they might not be deploying fiber to every endpoint, they're looking upstream in their networks for how do they build more robust capacity, how do they serve the emerging needs of broadband users of all sizes. And so you will find licensed spectrum, you will find fiber, you'll find other alternative technologies, and certainly unlicensed spectrum in use.
Is unlicensed an inferior technology to build a broadband network? Can you have a very successful, secure network under an unlicensed platform?
So one of the things that, to answer your question, not inferior, I think that the question comes down in any network, how is the network deployed and how is it managed? You know, that has a lot to do with the quality of the experience that a customer on the endpoint is going to have. When the NTIA BEAD NOFO came out and unlicensed spectrum was not included in their definition of reliable broadband service, we asked them why. And the clarification that they gave to us, and this was the only thing that they said was the hiccup, is they said that they were concerned about future availability of unlicensed spectrum. And I suppose that that's a valid concern, especially in congested markets. Not so much in rural areas that we're trying to cover, but subsequent to the BEAD NOFO being released, the FCC released a huge new block of unlicensed spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band. So the FCC continues to work on meeting the spectrum demands of all of the users of spectrum, whether it's licensed or unlicensed. So now, if we look backwards, I think perhaps if everyone had had a chance to do it over again, if unlicensed spectrum had been in the room, we would have seen a much lower cost of deployment for the BEAD program. We would be talking about universal coverage for all under that program, instead of now some of the discussions that are going along the lines of, well, you know, $42.5 billion might not be enough to cover everybody.
Well, let's get to BEAD in a second, because
Sure.
And you mentioned two scenarios, CBRS and 6 gigahertz. I think I still got the stabbings from some of your compatriots.
You got the scars?
I got the scars. In the past, though, and maybe this is a segue to where we want to go on BEAD, your members were very vocal to me, certainly, and to the rest of the commission and others, that they not only didn't want federal broadband subsidies, they certainly didn't want them going to their competitors, but they weren't really interested in seeking federal dollars.
Right.
That cowboy mentality was, we're making this happen without the government. We don't need your support, and we certainly don't need you subsidizing our competitor. Has
Right.
that changed as the government has continues? You know, it doesn't look like it's going to stop finding ways to subsidize broadband, you know, for the unserved populations. And I worked on cleaning up CAF and RDOF and testified on BEAD. So those pots of money are continuing. You got Reconnect and lots of other. Has that changed where you've been forced by circumstances to be not only outspoken on policy, but also, hey, you know, we can use these dollars to extend our network?
Yeah, I think that we're closer to the point of understanding the value that the subsidies bring, because we now have a national priority, a clear national priority for broadband for all. Having said that, keep in mind that our members have been self-sufficient for a long, long time. I mean, they had to get started, as I said, extending from the poles where the other carriers stopped. So the self-reliance became a very important part of not only how they thought, but also how they operated. In many cases, they were hard to bank because you're dealing with rural communities that might not have banks that have the strength to be able to support them. So the self-reliance aspect of it was very much real. And it's a little bit inappropriate, I suppose, as a joke, but it'll at least provide the flavor. There's the old joke that a camel is a horse that was designed by a committee. And when you ask the government to do anything, sometimes you will get sort of the camel when you were expecting a horse. So when it comes to subsidy programs, the ability to play into those programs and to partner with those programs kind of comes down to the guidance that has been established for those programs. The USDA programs, for example, come out of the Rural Utilities Service, which has historically been very focused on rural telco co-ops, for example. It's a little harder for broadband providers that are in the WISPA community to break in to the RUS programs or the USDA programs, although we've had some success doing that. So yes, to answer your question, of course, they don't want government funds being used to overbuild or subsidize competitors because that creates an unfair advantage. But in terms of a participation in the program or the programs that are available, there's a recognition that for the first time, you actually have the federal government trying to consolidate or standardize the programs that are being offered in a way that supports this national priority for broadband. So yes, there's still the agility, there's the why do we really have to do this because we built it out on our own without this kind of help, but there's a recognition that this is kind of a definition of success. This is like the dog that finally caught the car. You know, okay, we've got their attention. Now let's go succeed together.
So then you brought up the BEAD, the alternative technology proceeding by NTIA on the BEAD program. What are what did you think of their fiber first approach? You started talking about that, and then why do you think they changed course of action?
The thing that puzzled us was that, you know, everybody's going to read the Infrastructure Act, the IHA, differently, but the work we had done in advocacy before that was passed all suggested that we were going to get a tech neutral bill. And in fact, the IHA does call for tech neutrality. So when NTIA turned it into a fiber first program, then we're obviously puzzled and concerned by that. But the main thing that we saw was that $42.5 billion was not going to be enough to get it done. And so we worked to partner with NTIA to collaborate to make sure that they were aware of the things we were seeing. We commissioned an economic study that we shared with them that showed that it was not going to be possible to get there from here with $42.5 billion. We worked with a group called the Vernonburg Group to create a dashboard for state broadband offices, and it's publicly available, where state broadband officers can basically twiddle the knobs to look at the combination of federal and state sources of funding and the goals that they have in place to understand kind of where that extremely high cost per location threshold would need to be in order to be able to make the funds reach. But all of that still kind of serves up this fiber first mentality. And if I haven't said this clearly enough, I love fiber. We love fiber. We're not opposed to fiber. We have a lot of fiber being used in our association today. But we're not siloed on fiber. So we're relying on really what is the best way to get coverage done. And if the priority for BEAD is to cover everyone, if we can imagine a day soon where everyone who wants connectivity has connectivity, then there's a way to get there from here, utilizing all technologies. But if you're going to say, no, we mean everybody can get connectivity, but it has to be fiber, it's going to be very expensive and time consuming to get there.
Did NTIA wait too long to put out this alternative technology? You know, what took them so long to get here? And then, you know, we're many years down the road from the IIJA, and we're, you know, still years away from actually seeing some build out. What's your take on, you know, the timing of this seems to be kind of suspect?
Well, for what I would say is that, yeah, for my taste, they waited too long. But let me also say that we've got great partnerships with NTIA. We really do. And I think that many people associated with the program and those that architected the program saw BEAD as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try to kind of future-proof what was going to happen. And so how do you do that? They felt like fiber was the way to go forward. And frankly, there have been, and there always are, technological innovations that, you know, come through. So if you take a snapshot of an industry at any given time, or a technology at any time, it'll be different than the one that you take a few years down the road. So we could get people covered if every technology can play. And we can do that faster than we can with a fiber-only focus. The
comment period's closed. Do you all favor the alternative technology proposal as it was presented? I'm sure there's going to be some movement on it and some changes here and there. But in general, you're in favor. If I take your comments.
Yeah, we have welcomed the NTIA's publication of that. We've offered our own comments back with some suggestions for how it could be further improved. We're happy to see.
What's more important to your members, that actually the areas that you currently serve get knocked out from being overbuilt by BEAD, or is it the opportunity to potentially receive funding to serve these areas that probably are going to be really challenging, certainly?
I think that, you know, and I have not asked this question of the membership directly, so I may get feedback, But my guess, and my best guess, is that they're more concerned about overbuilding than they are about participating, because there are many issues about participation because of the way the program has been constructed. We can get into those, but they were there in NTIA's, in their opinion, for a good reason, but in some cases they come from the IIJA, but they're problematic for smaller providers. You know, I guess a way of looking at it, as I try to deal in analogies, is that if you have some urgent need, an accident or something, or a trauma, I mean, you want EMTs on the scene immediately. You don't want to wait until the federal government can come and build the trauma center next to the scene of the accident. And WISPs tend to be the EMTs. They're the ones that get out there quickly. So after they've deployed their own funding to get there, they don't mind competition. But if you're going to now have a competitor that comes in with a big government subsidy to come and compete with them, then that diminishes their opportunity to continue to invest in their networks and continue to grow and to ultimately seek a return of their own. So overbuilding would be the big concern, I think.
You did talk about, or started referencing some of the requirements from both, some that were in the IIJA, some flow from the NOFO and policy decisions. Right. Do you find, you know, some states have balked at them, and some providers have balked at different requirements and are challenging some of those? Where do you put yourself in terms of what NTIA has created on this overlay of the program itself, when the goal is to get service to everyone? Here are some other policy objectives that they're seeking. Does that add costs to your build outs and make it harder to reach residents that don't have service today?
Yeah, so and I can kind of go to the well on a lot of these subjects, but I'm going to pick on maybe one just to sort of emphasize the issue. I'm going to start by saying that if you look at all the players in the space, whether it's NTIA or it's the people who drafted and passed the bill, or it's the individual service providers, I think everyone is in the room bringing their own ability to be good stewards of the resources that they have, whether they're private resources or public resources. So if you're NTIA or the FCC, you're looking for a way to make sure that this, in the case of BEAD NOFO, $42.5 billion is deployed wisely. So the requirements that you're going to put in place are going to reflect your priorities for stewardship. So for example, we're going to put a requirement for letters of credit, or for audited financials, or for other means that will allow the subgrantee or the applicants to demonstrate that they're understanding our requirements for stewardship. Everybody's on the same page about stewardship, but when you look at the way that you apply it for a smaller company operating in a rural area already, chances are the bank that they've banked with for the last 20 years is not going to be able to issue a letter of credit under any circumstance, because they don't have the financial strength or the WISP rating to do it. Disadvantage to the small player. Similarly, for audited financials, they're not publicly traded companies. They'd rather spend the $50,000 on improving their network than spend it on an accounting team to come in and satisfy a requirement that is showing up in an application document. So the tension here is not so much a technology use tension or selection, it's really more about how do you accomplish the goals and the requirements for stewardship in a way that creates this diversity of the applicant pool, from the largest carriers down to the smallest ones who are actively serving their communities. So those are the sorts of issues that we have with the BEAD NOFO. When you look at whether it's prevailing wage or other aspects that have been put in place, they all have a heart for accomplishing something that's related to stewardship, but they tend to exclude the smaller providers that are already there.
So you started to indicate the cost or the size of BEAD may not go as far as originally anticipated. We've heard from at least 15 states they think they're going to run out of money. How do you envision when you're talking to your members? Does that seem accurate? It's probably more? What's your take on how far the dollars are going to stretch?
Well, the economic study that we did a year and a half ago suggested that at minimum you're probably going to be looking at, I think, $60 or $70 billion to be able to get there. And that includes some determination of an extremely high cost per location threshold, so it's not 100% fiber at all locations. But whether on a state-by-state basis those numbers, add up because every state's different. And the reality is the legislation and the BEAD NOFO call for coverage to all Americans. So it would be a failure to say we got as far as we could because we understood that our job was to deploy fiber, and we'll wait for the next funding round to complete the job. Because there are people in the digital divide now who don't want to wait another 10 years or 5 years or 3 years if the job can be done now. So for the states that are saying, we can't get there from here, rethink the technologies that you're allowing in the room and you'll get there. You really will.
Is it too late for them? I mean, considering where we are in the cycle, or do they have, they've got most of them have just short of a year before they have to, before they're required by law to turn back that information to NTIA to do the final stamp. So there is time to read, but are they under the pressure from this? It seems like towards the last couple of months, NTIA is like, pick up the pace, everybody, right?
I want to be very careful about stepping in front of what the states are doing because they are doing an incredible job with the challenging timelines and with, in some cases, the resources that they have available. But what we are hearing back is that they're concerned about participation in the applicant pool. In some cases, they're not getting sort of signals that there's a lot of interest in pursuing the BEAD funding because of either the layers of requirements that are already in place or concerns about economic returns. So we'll see. But I do think it's safe to say that the process could have gone a lot smoother and a lot faster if there had been more technology choices available for applicants in the room.
If you had to guess, based on where things are and your expertise and the folks that you're talking to, do you envision states making some of those changes, or do you think we're going to get to the point which you alluded to, we're down the road and we come back and we realize we're $10–15 billion short and we try and get another tranche, and anyone who's left is going to have to wait in the 5 to 10 range?
Yeah, it's going to vary state by state, but what I think is going to happen is that NTIA is going to tell them they have to get it done with the funds that are available. And so that we're going to see some flexibility in programs as they try to wrestle with the realities that they're seeing. And until they see what the applicant pool looks like, and this can be even the pre-application stage, if they're not seeing an expression of interest now based on the programs, that's a pretty clear indication that maybe something needs to happen on the program. And you would know this from your time at the FCC. If there's a deadline for an application at the FCC, it might be crickets until 12 hours before the deadline. So you can't necessarily read into the fact that you've got sort of slow returns before the deadline. But my point is that I think we're going to see very quickly on a state-by-state basis what the real level of interest is and how far the money can go based on the subgrantee interest, and then we'll see the flexibility begin to emerge.
Well, you're not wrong in your analogy of the FCC, but I will say, if it were my program, I'd have those conversations. I'd certainly, if I was an NTA, I'd want to know how are providers stepping up. They certainly,
right.
My indications are they are having those conversations, not necessarily in the nicest way, but we'll let that play out. So let's shift topics just ever so slightly. You're in Washington, D.C. today. What are your members focused on other than BEAD? What are their top priorities in the legislative, regulatory environment that challenge them?
So really anything that has to do with broadband deployment is going to be of interest to members. We're following with great interest the never-ending Farm Bill kind of work that's happening. We're also trying to make sure that that other agencies like USDA, Department of Agriculture, understand the role that our members play. But in a bigger sense, we're also beginning to wonder aloud, what happens when we actually reach the destination of full connectivity? What do internet service providers look like at that point in time? And you see a level of diversity that's already emerging in rural areas, for example, precision agriculture, which the FCC cares about as a committee, and we participate in that. There are applications for broadband that guide ultimately or steer future broadband deployments. What are the needs of a particular network based on how it's actually going to be used? You see things happening in telemedicine that are pretty interesting that have to do, in fact, with some robotics that require telematics that will require careful attention for what broadband networks can do. So to the extent that that kind of traces on something that's of interest to a regulatory body or to the Congress, whether we're talking about federal or state level, then those are areas where WISPA is at work.
Are there areas where the regulatory apparatus and the Congress can be helpful? I think of permitting and polls. And are there areas where they've added layers upon layers of regulatory requirements on ISPs, including many of your companies? I think of things like net neutrality and digital discrimination and data security and the laundry list of what asks or demands, actually, not more, legal obligations. Are there benefits that the government can bring, and then how do your members handle the compliance with all of these other things with small shops?
Over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the compliance requirements for our members. And while we don't typically involve ourselves in appellate kind of matters, appellate matters, we're now involved in 3 appeals of FCC activities, including net neutrality. And we can go in to those, but those are also active cases. The point is that we will push back on what we see as regulatory overreach. And by that, I mean something that's going to impact the ability for our members to be able to deliver services efficiently. There's obviously a legitimate role for regulators in our space, but where you draw that line is where you kind of get the arm wrestle. So those are things that we look at very closely, and that's an active role that WISPA plays.
And can they do any good for you? Is there, beyond the subsidy side of the equation we talked about, are there policy issues that you come forward and say, hey, we could really use some help?
Yeah, so when we talk about policy, if we're talking about spectrum policy for FCC, for example, we're always on the hunt for broadband solutions. There are things that we're seeing happening in the space right now that are really dramatically important. There are things that are in some of the upper bands, 37 gigahertz, for example, that are exciting. That story will change year by year. And so that's one of the things that the FCC has been brilliant at, and it's kind of the core mission of the FCC, turning to other agencies. NTIA, for example, when I first met Alan Davidson, one of the first things that I told him was that I've had kind of a love affair with NTIA that goes back to early in my career, because I was working on radio propagation models, and this was in the early wireless industry, and the purveyor of radio RF propagation models is the ITS of NTIA. So when we talk about how these agencies can help, I think we tend to see them kind of on their business end, on the regulatory end of what it is that they do, but what they're actually doing is they are curating and collating science or experience or input on how to move an economy forward in a real significant way. So, and I'm very serious about that. I think that the FCC and the NTIA have had major roles to play in the development in our industry, and I expect them to continue to do so.
Last question. In 5 years from now, what does your association look like? Are you, or maybe in broadband in general, are you anticipating consolidation with all of the dollars that have been out there, lots of different funding streams? Are we going to see fewer players in broadband as they bulk up, or are we going to continue to see kind of what we have today?
We have some models that we can kind of follow. I'm not saying this is where it goes, but when you think about other national priorities, going back 100 years, rural electrification, rural telephony, these national priorities for these sorts of networks, the electric grid, all of these things have had over time an increased level of oversight by regulatory bodies and an increased level of interest from the capital community and how you get further economies of scale. Anybody who builds a business is ultimately going to be thinking about an exit strategy, so of course there's going to be consolidation, there's going to be combinations in our industry. I think one of the things that's, for me, kind of fascinating to look at is that we've spent so much time debating over how to define broadband from a speed standard basis, what's the download and upload speed. And what we're really not tracking very closely is what all these providers are actually doing and how does it contribute to the customer experience. We'll see arguments about our low Earth orbit satellites? Are they broadband? Well, they're providers, and they're serving a major role in the digital divide today. For fixed wireless access, which I'm referring to as sort of the mobility carriers provisioning of a broadband data service, well, we're the fixed wireless team, they're the fixed wireless access team, and they're coming alongside in ways that are really interesting. There's a lot of overlapping opportunities for infrastructure, for example, certainly customers. So when we talk about serving endpoints, I think we're going to see a lot of this parallel activity begin to evolve in a way that's going to change the face of several associations. What I do know is this, I think that WISPA has a history of being the association for the hometown ISPs. And I think by that includes any ISP that's agile, that's deploying technologies from a broad palette of technologies that are available. And we're certainly going to be intentional about being relevant to that community, regardless of what the membership looks like. I would expect to see it continue to grow but evolve. So it's possible we might have fewer members and they're bigger, or we may see an explosion of new applications for broadband that need a home in a place like WISPA.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I can't thank you enough. David, it's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Really appreciate spending some time with me.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, thanks so much.